In late 1966, a North Vietnamese radar operator named Tuyen watched the screen in front of him fill with light that should not have been there. He understood for the first time that the sky itself had learned to lie to him. He had trained for months to read that screen, a skill that felt, by the time he finished his training, almost like a second sense. A clean scope showed the truth of the sky in simple, honest strokes. A blip here, a track there, real aircraft moving at real speeds along real headings, each one a fact he could report with confidence to the crew waiting to fire the missile his radar guided. He had learned to trust that screen completely because for the first months of his service, it had never once given him reason not to. That night, the screen stopped telling the truth. Where there should have been one aircraft, there were suddenly dozens scattered across his display in a chaotic bloom of false returns that gave no indication which, if any, of them was real. He adjusted his gain, checked his tuning, ran through every diagnostic step his training had given him, and the false returns did not go away. Somewhere out there, in the dark sky over his country, an American aircraft was doing something to his radar that his instructors had never fully prepared him to face. Tuyen could not know the name of the crew flying the aircraft that had done this to him, or the small clouds of shredded metal foil drifting invisibly through the sky that were the actual cause of the chaos on his screen. He knew only that the confident, simple skill he had trained for had, in a single night, become far less reliable than he had ever been told it would be. That is the story of what happened when the sky itself started lying to the men whose entire job was reading it honestly. Now let me show you exactly how the lie worked. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand what actually happened to Tuyen's screen that night, you first have to understand the radar system he depended on, and the quiet, technical war being waged against it from the moment it was built. To understand what stunned Tuyen that night, you first have to understand the radar system he had trained on, and the confidence it had every reason to give him in the months before everything changed. North Vietnam's air defense network, built with substantial Soviet assistance, centered on the SA-2 surface-to-air missile system, a real and formidable weapon that had already proven itself capable of bringing down high-flying American aircraft that had once considered themselves safe from ground fire entirely. The missile itself depended on a guidance radar the Americans came to call fan song, which tracked an approaching aircraft and fed that tracking data to the missile in flight, steering it toward its target with a precision that made the SA-2 a genuine and serious threat to every American aircraft operating over the North. This radar was supported by a broader network. Early warning radars watched for approaching aircraft at long range. Anti-aircraft gun-laying radars guided the conventional flak batteries defending the same targets the missiles protected. Tuyen's training had taught him to operate within this system with real confidence, because for a period of the war, that confidence was entirely justified. Early SA-2 engagements caught American pilots genuinely unprepared, and the missile's initial combat record demonstrated real, serious lethality against aircraft that had no effective countermeasure to a threat rising from the ground with that kind of accuracy. Tuyen and men like him had every reason to trust the system they operated because it worked, reliably, exactly the way their training said it would. Picture the earliest days of that trust being built, because it began well before Tuyen ever sat at his own console. Soviet technicians, working alongside their Vietnamese counterparts, assembled the first missile battalions from crates shipped in sections, calibrating radar and missile together with a precision that impressed even the Vietnamese officers watching the process for the first time. The first combat firing of the system, in the summer of 1965, brought down an American aircraft that had believed itself safe at an altitude no Vietnamese gun could reach, and word of that success spread through the fledgling air defense force fast, becoming the foundation of a confidence that would carry through months of genuine effectiveness before anything challenged it. What Tuyen did not yet understand in those first months was that the Americans had identified his radar as a specific, high-priority problem to be solved. An entire technical and tactical effort was already being built, dedicated to defeating it. This effort would eventually include dedicated aircraft built for nothing but electronic deception, specialized hunter aircraft built to seek out and destroy the radar sites themselves, and a body of countermeasure equipment developed specifically to make Tuyen's screen lie to him at the exact moments when the truth mattered most. None of this existed yet in any serious form during Tuyen's early training. By the time he sat at his console on the night this story opened with, it very much did. Now, understand exactly what filled Tuyen's screen that night. Because the mechanism, once explained, is almost disarmingly simple, even though its effect on a trained radar operator was genuinely disorienting. Chaff consisted of thin strips of metallic foil, cut to lengths precisely calculated to reflect radar signals at specific frequencies, released from aircraft in enormous quantities to create clouds of false returns on enemy radar screens. Each individual strip was tiny, weightless, drifting on the wind after release, but a sufficient quantity of it, dispersed correctly, produced an effect on a radar screen that looked remarkably similar to a genuine aircraft or to dozens of them at once. American aircraft released chaff in patterns and quantities specifically designed to overwhelm a radar operator's ability to distinguish real targets from false ones, sometimes creating what amounted to a moving corridor of false returns that could mask the actual strike aircraft moving through it. Think about what this actually demanded of a man like Tuyen, sitting at his console in the middle of an active engagement. His entire training assumed a return on his screen represented something real, an assumption that had held true for the whole of his service up to that point. Chaff broke that assumption completely, and it broke it without announcing itself. There was no warning that told him this particular return was false and that one was genuine. There was only a screen suddenly full of returns, indistinguishable from each other by any simple visual inspection, forcing him to apply judgment under exactly the kind of time pressure that made careful judgment hardest to sustain. This was compounded by active jamming, a related but distinct technique that worked through a different mechanism entirely, where chaff created false physical reflections, electronic jamming aircraft, most prominently the EB-66, flying specifically dedicated missions for this purpose, broadcast their own radio energy directly at Tuyen's radar, either flooding it with noise that obscured everything or transmitting deceptive signals crafted to mimic and distort the radar's own returns. A skilled jamming crew could make a radar operator's screen fill with static that hid a genuine target entirely, or could feed false tracking information into the very system meant to guide a missile, corrupting the data at its source. Together, chaff and jamming did not need to defeat Tuyen's radar technically in the sense of breaking the machine itself. They needed only to defeat his confidence in what the machine was telling him at the exact moment the confidence mattered most. To understand the full weight of what happened to operators like Tuyen, you have to understand the specific, compressed decision-making this created, because the entire crisis played out in a matter of seconds, under conditions specifically engineered to make clear thinking as difficult as possible. An engagement against American aircraft demanded fast, confident decisions. A radar operator had to acquire a target, track it accurately enough to support a missile launch, and maintain that track through the missile's flight to guidance, all within a window of time measured in a small number of minutes at most. Under normal conditions, difficult but manageable, this process rewarded exactly the kind of trained confidence Tuyen's early service had given him. Under chaff and jamming, the same process became a race against confusion, where every second spent trying to identify the genuine target among false returns was a second the actual American aircraft used to close distance, change course, or complete its attack run entirely unopposed. Operators developed real techniques to fight through this confusion, and it is worth crediting the skill this actually required because it was genuine and hard-won. Experienced radar personnel learned to recognize certain signatures that distinguish chaff returns from genuine aircraft, differences in how the returns moved, how they behaved over successive sweeps of the radar, subtle patterns that a trained eye could sometimes catch even in the middle of a cluttered screen. This was not a skill that existed in any manual at the start of the war. It was built gradually by operators who had lived through enough of these engagements to develop an instinct for the false amid the real. Picture the actual physical experience of one of these engagements, because it is worth dwelling on. Tuyen's hands moving fast across his controls, adjusting gain and filtering. His eyes scanning a screen crowded with light that would not resolve into anything trustworthy. His supervisor beside him, watching the same chaos, offering no clear answer because there was none to offer. Seconds passing, each one carrying real consequence, while the actual American aircraft continued somewhere in that cluttered sky, invisible inside the noise built specifically to hide it. But this skill had real limits, and honest accounts of these engagements described the persistent underlying strain of never being fully certain, even with experience, that a given track was trustworthy. A missile fired at a false target, guided by data corrupted by jamming, was a missile wasted, expensive, difficult to replace, and a missed opportunity to engage the real threat. The pressure this created was not simply technical, it was the deep, corrosive uncertainty of doing an already difficult job while suspecting, with real justification, that the tool in front of you might be actively working against you rather than for you. The scale of what American electronic warfare achieved against this system is not a matter of impression alone. It is documented in hard, measurable numbers that tell the story of Tuyen's confusion multiplied across an entire war. In the earlier phases of the air campaign against North Vietnam, before countermeasures had matured, the SA-2 system achieved a genuinely dangerous hit rate against American aircraft, forcing significant changes in tactics and inflicting real losses. By the later stages of the sustained bombing campaign, after chaff, jamming, and the dedicated radar hunting Wild Weasel aircraft had matured into a coordinated system of their own, the picture had changed dramatically. Only a small fraction of missiles fired actually achieved hits. Roughly 1 in 48 by the end of the major sustained campaign in the late 1960s, the ratio grew even more lopsided by the final intense bombing campaign at the end of 1972, when only roughly 1 missile in 68 fired found its target. Think about what that decline actually represents, set beside Tuyen's own experience at his console. It is not simply a story of American technology improving in the abstract. It is the accumulated, measurable effect of exactly the confusion this story has described. Repeated engagement after engagement across the length of an entire air war until a missile system that had once posed a genuine and serious threat to American aircraft had been reduced to a weapon that missed its target the overwhelming majority of the time it was actually fired. That decline was not free. It represented years of technical development, real losses among the American air crews who flew the dangerous jamming and radar hunting missions this story describes, and a sustained, expensive campaign fought specifically to produce exactly this result. Layered on top of the chaff and jamming was a third threat that made Tuyen's job harder still, one that turned the simple act of using his radar into its own kind of risk. Wild Weasel aircraft, equipped with receivers built specifically to detect the fan song's own emissions, could home in on a radar the moment it activated to guide a missile, following the signal back to its source and attacking the site directly. This meant that turning his radar on, the single action his entire job depended on, now carried the possibility of drawing exactly the kind of attack it was meant to prevent. Some crews learned to activate their radars only in short, deliberate bursts, tracking a target just long enough to guide a shot before shutting down again, trading tracking accuracy for survival in a calculation that had no equivalent in Tuyen's original training. And it is worth being honest about what this decline did and did not mean for the war as a whole. A degraded missile system was not a defeated air defense. North Vietnam's combined air defenses, missiles, guns, and fighters together remained a serious threat throughout the war, and American losses to that combined system remained real and significant, even as the SA-2's individual effectiveness declined. The story this script tells is about one specific weapon's effectiveness being deliberately degraded through electronic warfare. It is not a story about North Vietnamese air defense as a whole being defeated and the men who continued operating radar and gun systems throughout the war deserve credit for a genuinely difficult and dangerous job. It would be incomplete to end this story with American technology simply overwhelming a passive, helpless opponent, because North Vietnamese air defense forces adapted continuously to these countermeasures, and that adaptation deserves real and specific credit. Radar and missile crews developed genuine tactical responses to the confusion chaff and jamming created, rather than simply absorbing the disruption passively. Some units learned to fire missiles using techniques specifically designed to work around degraded tracking data, accepting a lower probability of a clean hit in exchange for forcing American aircraft into evasive maneuvers that disrupted their own bombing runs. Radar operators learned, through hard experience, to cross-reference information from multiple radar systems simultaneously, since jamming that successfully corrupted one type of radar often left others comparatively unaffected. A skilled crew that could rapidly synthesize information from several imperfect sources sometimes achieved a clearer picture than any single radar could provide alone. Picture what this cross-referencing actually looked like in practice, because it demanded real coordination under pressure. One operator calling out what his early warning radar showed, another comparing that against the gun-laying radar's own picture. A third watching the fan song itself, all three men talking fast, building a composite picture out of three imperfect sources faster than any single jammed radar could provide on its own. This was not written into any manual at the start of the war. It was invented under fire by crews who understood that the old method of trusting one screen completely no longer worked. There was also a broader doctrinal adaptation, one that reflected the same patient, resource-conscious, strategic thinking this whole series has described in other North Vietnamese contexts. As the reliability of individual missile engagements declined, air defense doctrine shifted to treat the missile threat itself, even when it missed, as a valuable tool for shaping American tactics. Aircraft forced to maneuver evasively to avoid a missile, even one guided by corrupted data and unlikely to score a direct hit, were aircraft forced away from optimal bombing altitudes, aircraft whose accuracy against their intended targets suffered as a direct consequence. In this sense, a missile that missed was not necessarily a missile wasted. Picture a training session months into this new reality where an experienced battery commander walked a group of newer crews through exactly this reasoning, because the lesson had to be taught deliberately rather than left to accumulate through accident. He told them plainly that a missile guided by corrupted data fired into a chaff cloud with only a modest chance of a clean kill was not a wasted shot if it forced the aircraft above them into a hard turn away from its intended target. He wanted them to stop measuring success only by direct hits and to start measuring it by disruption, by the bombs that fell short or wide because a pilot had to break his run early to avoid a threat that might, this time, actually connect. This was a genuine shift in how an entire generation of crews were taught to think about their own weapon, forced into being by an enemy who had made the old measure of success unreliable. This honest accounting matters because it keeps the story from reading as simple American technological triumph over a passive victim. The men operating North Vietnam's air defenses throughout this period were skilled, adaptive professionals fighting a genuinely difficult technical contest against a wealthier and more technologically sophisticated opponent, and doing so with real ingenuity. The decline in missile effectiveness was real and significant. It was also met continuously by an opponent who refused to simply accept it as an unanswerable defeat. Tuyen served through the rest of the war in the same demanding technical role, and in the years afterward, he thought often about that first night the screen had filled with returns that should not have been there. He came to understand that the confusion he felt that night had not been a personal failing or evidence that his training had been inadequate. It had been his first encounter with a deliberate, expensive, and highly sophisticated effort built specifically to produce exactly the confusion he experienced by an opponent with the resources to develop entire dedicated aircraft and equipment for no purpose other than making his job harder. Understanding this over the months and years that followed changed how he approached every subsequent engagement. He stopped expecting the screen to simply tell him the truth, the way his early training had assumed it always would. He began treating every engagement as a contest of skill and judgment against an adversary actively trying to deceive him. He thought, too, about the particular kind of expertise this forced him and men like him to develop, a skill that did not exist in any manual when the war began and had to be built painstakingly through hundreds of engagements. He came to take genuine professional pride in this hard-won skill, the ability to read subtle signatures in a cluttered screen that a less experienced operator would have missed entirely, even as he understood that this skill had been forced into existence by an opponent's deliberate effort to make his original training insufficient. He remembered, in particular, training a younger operator years later and finding himself teaching a version of vigilance that had no equivalent in his own early instruction. He told the young man more than once that the screen was not his friend and not his enemy. It was simply a tool, honest most of the time, capable of being turned against him by a patient adversary at exactly the moment it mattered most. The young operator absorbed this the way Tuyen once had, slowly through experience rather than instruction alone, until the lesson became instinct rather than rule. And he came, in his later years, to a complicated respect for the men flying those jamming aircraft, the unseen crews on the other end of every confused engagement, doing a job he came to understand was genuinely dangerous in its own right. He learned over the years that the aircraft creating his confusion were themselves flying into range of exactly the missiles his own side fired, unarmed, dependent entirely on electronic trickery rather than any weapon of their own for their survival. He had spent that first confused night thinking only of his own difficulty. He came eventually to understand that the men causing it had been taking a real and serious risk of their own every single time they flew close enough to make his screen lie convincingly. Decades later, at an international veterans gathering that brought together men from both sides of that long war, Tuyen found himself in conversation with a former American electronic warfare officer who had, it turned out, flown missions in exactly the kind of skies Tuyen had once tried so hard to see through. The two men compared notes cautiously at first, the way old adversaries do, and found, to their mutual surprise, that they had each spent years thinking about the other's job with a kind of professional curiosity neither had ever expected to satisfy. The American described the fear of orbiting unarmed at the edge of missile range, waiting to see if his jamming had worked, with no way to know from inside his own aircraft whether Tuyen's radar had found him anyway. Tuyen described the specific, sick feeling of a screen he could no longer trust. Neither man apologized for what he had done. Both, in their own way, finally understood the other side of a contest that had once felt, to each of them, entirely one-sided. Here is what Tuyen finally understood about the night his screen filled with light that should not have been there, and why it mattered far beyond one confused engagement. He had trained to trust a machine, and for months that trust had been entirely justified, because the machine had never once given him reason to doubt it. What changed was not the machine itself, in any mechanical sense. It was the introduction of a deliberate, sustained, and expensive effort to corrupt the information that machine provided, waged by an opponent with the resources to build entire aircraft and equipment systems for no purpose other than making one radar operator, sitting at one console, unable to fully trust what he was seeing at the exact moment trust mattered most. That is the real meaning behind the numbers this story has described. The sharp decline in missile effectiveness across the length of the air war, from a genuinely dangerous weapon in its early engagements to one that missed the overwhelming majority of the time it was fired by the war's final years. That decline was never really about a machine getting worse. It was about a machine's operator being placed under a sustained, deliberate campaign to make correct judgment as difficult as possible, at the precise moments when correct judgment mattered most. You do not need to physically break your opponent's tools to defeat them. You only need to make your opponent doubt what those tools are telling him, consistently at the moments that matter, and that doubt alone can accomplish nearly everything that outright destruction might have accomplished at a fraction of the cost and risk. The Americans never needed to destroy every SA-2 radar in North Vietnam to dramatically reduce the threat that system posed. They needed only to make the men reading those radars unable to fully trust what they saw, and the missiles kept missing, engagement after engagement, for exactly that reason. Tuyen watched his screen fill with false light on a night in 1966, certain at first that something had simply broken, and spent the rest of his war learning that nothing had broken at all. The machine was working exactly as it always had. It was simply being deliberately, patiently deceived by an enemy who had decided that the fastest way to defeat a radar was never to destroy it, but to teach the man reading it that he can no longer be certain of anything it told him. That is what American chaff and jamming did to NVA radar operators. Not silence their radars, poison their certainty. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just those famous battles with their famous names, but the quiet, technical duels fought in radio waves and radar screens that shaped who came home on both sides of the wire. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, And it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in Vietnam, an electronic warfare officer, a radar operator, an air defense crewman, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story, like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.